Claude responded, "At my son's wedding rehearsal dinner, the bride raised her glass to toast our family. At my son's wedding rehearsal dinner, the bride raised her glass to toast our family." My son leaned close and whispered in my ear, "Dad, don't sign anything. Not tonight. Not tomorrow." 6 words. No explanation. I kept smiling for the photographs, but the retired detective inside me knew something had already gone wrong, and had probably been going wrong for a very long time. I'm grateful you're here with me tonight. Tell me in the comments, what part of the country are you listening from? I read every one of them. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a story like this. A few names and details in this story have been adjusted for privacy, but the lesson is real, and I think you'll carry it with you. I'm 64 years old, and for 29 years I carried a badge for the City of Tulsa Police Department, the last 11 of them as a homicide detective. You spend 3 decades sitting across a table from people who are lying to you, and you learn something most people never have to learn. The truth and a good performance can look identical from 3 feet away. I used to think that training made me untouchable. I was wrong, and it nearly cost me the only son I have left. My name is Walter Pruitt. I live outside Broken Arrow, Oklahoma, on 18 acres. My late wife Carol and I bought the year our son Nathan was born. There's a pond on the property that Carol stocked with bass, a workshop where I restore old radios as a hobby, and a porch that faces west so you can watch the sky turn colors most painters wouldn't dare attempt. Carol used to say that porch was the reason she married me, since I'd built it before I ever proposed to her, like I already knew we'd need somewhere to sit together and grow old. Carol passed in the fall of 2021. Ovarian cancer, caught late the way it almost always is. 14 months, from diagnosis to the funeral. I remember the oncologist at St. Francis Hospital, a young man with kind eyes and a box of tissues he clearly restocked every single morning, telling us what we could expect. Carol reached over and patted my hand before I could ask a single follow-up question, the way I would have in an interrogation room. "Walter," she said, "let the man finish." She always could read me better than any suspect I ever sat across from. We fought it together for as long as we could. She kept teaching piano lessons out of our front room until 6 weeks before the end, because she said her students needed normal more than they needed her pity. Nathan flew in from Denver most weekends, where he worked as a structural engineer, sleeping on a cot beside his mother's hospital bed, holding her hand through nights I wasn't strong enough to sit through myself. My son has always had more patience than I do. He gets that from her. On one of her last clear afternoons, Carol asked me to promise her 2 things. The first was easy. "Stop working so many hours consulting for the department," she said, her voice thin but her eyes sharp as ever. "Go fix your radios. Sit on that porch. Live like a retired man, not a cop who forgot how to retire." I promised her that one without hesitation. The second promise took her longer to get out. She held my hand tighter and said, "Walter, promise me you'll keep watching people the way you always have, especially around Nathan." I frowned at her, confused. She just shook her head slightly, like she didn't have the strength to explain further, and said, "You'll know when it matters. Promise me." I promised, mostly because I would have promised her anything in that room. 3 days later, she was gone, and I spent the better part of a year turning that second promise over in my mind without understanding it. The same way you turn over a piece of evidence that doesn't fit the rest of the case file. I kept the first promise easily enough. I stepped back from consulting work, spent my mornings with coffee on the porch, my afternoons in the workshop with old Zenith and Philco radios that hummed back to life under my hands. Nathan called every Sunday. He was 34, still single, still working long hours, designing bridge retrofits, still carrying grief for his mother, the way engineers carry everything, quietly and structurally, like something load-bearing. Then one Sunday evening in late winter, his voice on the phone sounded different, lighter, younger, almost, in a way I hadn't heard since he was a teenager. "Dad," he said, "I met someone. Her name is Vanessa Cole. We met at a charity gala for the Children's Hospital. She's a real estate consultant, and Dad, she actually listens when I talk about work. Not the polite kind of listening, the real kind." My chest did something complicated. Joy for him, sharp and immediate. because Nathan had spent 3 years quietly grieving a broken engagement he never talked about in detail. And underneath that joy, something smaller and colder stirred. A reflex built over 11 years of homicide work. The instinct that fires when a story sounds a little too smooth for real life. I pressed it down and asked him easy questions instead. Where's she from? Nathan said she'd grown up somewhere on the East Coast, moved to Denver about a decade back to build her client base. She works independently, he said. No brokerage, just her own referral network. Independent. No firm to call and verify anything against. I noted that quietly, the way I used to note a suspect's alibi that was just a little too clean. Has she ever been married? I asked. No, Nathan said, a slight hesitation in his voice. She told me she'd been waiting for the right person. In 29 years of police work, I'd learned that a woman in her late 30s who'd never once settled down usually fell into one of a few categories. She'd poured everything into a career. She was carrying wounds from something she hadn't finished healing. Or she was hiding something that made long relationships too risky to attempt. I told myself I was projecting my job onto my son's happiness, that grief and 30 years of interrogation rooms had made me suspicious of things that didn't deserve it. I'm happy for you, I told him, and I meant every word of it. He asked if she could come out to the ranch to meet me, and I said of course, come for dinner, and I meant that too. But after we hung up, I sat at the kitchen table for a long while with my cold coffee, and I heard Carol's voice the way I always did lately, quiet and certain. You'll know when it matters, Walter. Vanessa Cole arrived on a Saturday in April, driving a clean, newer SUV, dressed in the kind of understated, expensive clothes that whisper money instead of announcing it. She was tall, dark-haired, with an easy warmth in her eyes, and a handshake firm enough to mean it. She called me Detective Pruitt before Nathan had even introduced us properly, which meant she'd looked me up. She'd brought a bottle of good bourbon, expensive enough to show she'd done her research, not so expensive it looked like she was trying too hard. We walked the property before dinner, and she asked good questions, real ones, about the pond, the workshop, the fence line Carol used to walk every evening. She asked about my years on the force with the kind of focused attention that either meant genuine interest or years of practice making that interest look genuine. I couldn't tell which, and that itself told me something. Over dinner, she talked about her real estate work, closing deals across the Denver metro, advising clients on investment properties, referencing 2 recent transactions with just enough specific detail to sound credible, not enough that I could actually verify a word of it. She never stumbled, never searched for a word. No, every answer connected cleanly to the last one, like a case built by someone who understood exactly how cross-examination worked. In 29 years, I sat across from a lot of witnesses who'd rehearsed their story like actors rehearsing a role. The honest ones stumble. The honest ones contradict a small detail and correct themselves without panic. Vanessa Cole didn't have a single seam. At one point during dinner, her phone buzzed. She glanced at it, excused herself calmly, walked to the far end of the porch, and turned her back to us. "Client emergency," she said when she returned, smiling easily. "Nobody respects a Saturday evening anymore." I watched her hand grip the porch railing while she'd been on that call, watched her shoulders pull in tight for just a moment before she reset her whole posture and turned back around with that same warm smile locked into place. It was the most honest thing I saw out of her all evening, and it lasted less than 2 seconds. Later, after her taillights disappeared down our gravel drive, Nathan found me still sitting on the porch. "Well?" he asked, and I could hear him bracing for resistance. "She's impressive," I told him, and I meant it. But I sat alone a long time after he went to bed, thinking about a woman who could reset her expression that fast. And I heard Carol's voice again. "You'll know when it matters." By midsummer, Vanessa had become a fixture at the ranch, the way morning glory vine creeps up a fence post, slow and pleasant, until one day you look up and it's covered the whole thing, and you can't remember exactly when that happened. She helped me sand down an old Philco cabinet in the workshop. She asked Nathan detailed, patient questions about his bridge projects. And when Nathan told me her parents wanted to drive down from Colorado Springs to meet us, I said yes, before I'd fully considered what I was agreeing to. Her parents, Harold and Diane Cole, arrived on a Sunday in a well-kept minivan. Warm, unpretentious people who talked about Harold's 30 years as a high school shop teacher and Diane's years running a bakery that had closed during the pandemic. They brought a jar of homemade apple butter, and Diane pressed it into my hands with both of hers, telling me Vanessa had mentioned Carol, that she sounded like a remarkable woman. It was a kind thing to say, and it landed exactly the way a kind thing is supposed to land, which was, in its own way, part of what unsettled me. Not one story from that afternoon contradicted another. Not one had the natural friction of a real family, the small correction, the affectionately embellished detail. Everything fit together with a little too much precision, like a deposition that had been rehearsed until it stopped sounding rehearsed. That night, after they left, Nathan hugged me in the driveway the way he used to as a boy and said, "Dad, thank you. This meant everything to her." I held him and said nothing, because what was I supposed to say? That a lovely afternoon with a lovely family had felt, underneath all that warmth, like watching a very good closing argument. 3 weeks before the wedding, on a Tuesday morning, Nathan needed to print a document from Vanessa's laptop before she woke up. 3 browser tabs were open and unremarkable. The 4th was a spreadsheet, a file simply named Transition Plan XLSX. He almost closed it without a second look until he noticed the letters at the top of the sheet read NP, his own initials, Nathan Pruitt. He opened it. One column listed the ranch, appraised at $2.2 million. Another listed his retirement accounts, $410,000. A third listed a life insurance policy Carol had set up for him years ago, $300,000, with Vanessa's name already typed in as a proposed beneficiary update. A total figure at the bottom, just under $3 million, exact to the last few hundred, the kind of precision that requires weeks of quiet research, not a guess. A second column outlined the mechanism, beneficiary change form, joint account addition following marriage, and a note beside the insurance policy line that read, "Submit 48 hours after ceremony, before any family attorney is consulted." You don't write a phrase like that if what you're planning is innocent. You write it if you're planning something that has to be finished before anyone has time to stop it. He didn't tell me that night. He carried it alone for nearly 3 weeks, the way you carry something sharp, turning it over hoping to find an angle where it doesn't cut. He told me everything the morning after the rehearsal dinner, and I'm going to tell it the way he told it to me, because it's his story as much as mine. He'd heard the shower shut off and closed the laptop, his hands shaking badly enough that he nearly knocked it off the desk. When Vanessa came out, towel around her waist, relaxed and easy, she'd asked, "Find what you needed?" And he said, "Yes, I think I did." And then he made coffee and talked with her about seating charts for 40 minutes, while his heart slammed against his ribs so hard he could feel it in his teeth. When he told me all this, standing by the pond at 6 in the morning with frost still on the grass, his jaw was so tight I could see the muscle working in his cheek. "I kept trying to find another explanation, Dad," he said. "Maybe it's some kind of financial planning template. Maybe the initials are a coincidence. I went through every version of the story where I'm wrong. None of them explain that sentence about the family attorney. You don't write that for a template. You write that when you're planning to take something. Why didn't you call me the second you saw it?" I asked, my voice rougher than I meant it to come out. He looked up, and for the first time, his eyes broke. "Because I was terrified I was wrong," he said. "Because if I accused her and I was wrong, I'd have destroyed everything over nothing. I needed to be sure before I said it out loud. Dad, saying it out loud makes it real." "It's real," I told him quietly, and putting my hand on his shoulder, "and we're going to handle it together." He nodded, wiped his face, and something shifted behind his eyes, from raw pain into something colder and far more useful. I recognized that look. It was the same one Carol used to get right before she made a decision and stopped reconsidering it. At the rehearsal dinner 3 weeks later, 40 guests filled the reception hall of a restored barn venue outside Tulsa, string lights strung between old wooden beams, everything smelling like fresh flowers and grilled brisket, and the particular hum of people who believe they're celebrating something real. Vanessa stood near the head table in a pale green dress, laughing at something one of Nathan's co-workers had said, radiant, at ease, entirely convincing. I'd spent the last 3 weeks watching her differently than before. Not for cracks in her performance, but for evidence. There's a difference, and 29 years on the job taught me exactly how to tell them apart. I spoke with her for 10 minutes near the bar, asked her a specific question about a zoning dispute affecting one of her supposed listings, and watched something move fast across her face, a recalibration lasting less than a second, before her easy confidence reasserted itself, and she gave me an answer that sounded knowledgeable and said almost nothing specific at all. At 8:40, Nathan raised his glass to toast the evening, thanking everyone for coming, thanking Vanessa for choosing him. The whole room applauded. And as he sat back down beside me for a moment while Vanessa made her rounds through the tables, he leaned in close, his lips barely a breath from my ear. "Dad, don't sign anything. Not tonight. Not tomorrow." Then he straightened up, smiled at a passing cousin, and walked back toward Vanessa like nothing had happened at all. I stood there holding my glass of untouched whiskey, and those 6 words landed in my chest like something dropped from a height. Not a warning about paperwork, a warning to protect myself, specifically, from something already in motion. I breathed in slow through my nose, straightened my jacket, took a small, measured sip. Because a father standing at his son's rehearsal dinner needs to look exactly like a father enjoying his son's rehearsal dinner, whatever is happening underneath. The next morning, after Nathan told me everything by the pond, I called my old partner from the department, a man named Ray Doss, who'd left the force 8 years back and built a private investigation practice that was quiet, thorough, and worth every dollar. "I need a full background check," I told him. "Everything." Name's Vanessa Cole, late 30s, claims to be an independent real estate consultant out of Denver, no brokerage affiliation, East Coast background, never married, thin social media footprint. "My son is marrying her in 11 days. Ray was quiet a moment, and I heard the scratch of his pen. "Clean surface, or genuinely clean?" he asked. "Too clean," I said. "No employment gaps, no old photos with friends who've fallen out of touch, no messy history at all." "That's a constructed identity," Ray said. It wasn't a question. 3 days later, Ray called back, his voice carrying something I hadn't heard from him in years. Real urgency. "Walter," he said, "her name isn't Vanessa Cole. It's Renee Ashby, born in a small town outside Wichita, Kansas, 41 years old. I've got her original social security number and a juvenile record from Sedgwick County. There's no Vanessa Cole. There never was." My knees nearly buckled right there in my kitchen. Ray kept going. 2 years ago, under a different name, Diane Whitfield, she ran an operation in Little Rock, targeting a widowed rancher's son who ran a family cattle business. Same pattern. Independent professional cover. Thin, verifiable history. Marriage proposal within 4 months. Target's assets mapped out on paper before the wedding. The family caught it 3 days before the ceremony when the son's sister found similar documents. No money was taken, but the operation was identical down to the phrasing. "There's more," Ray said, his voice dropping. 18 months before that, in Amarillo, under the name Christina Boyd, she ran a longer operation against a widowed oil lease owner's daughter. That one wasn't caught in time. The family lost close to $400,000 before anyone understood what had happened. The father, a man named Gerald Whitcomb, took his own life 8 months later after his business partners forced him out over the losses. Ray paused. His daughter, Melissa Whitcomb, has spent the last year and a half trying to find the woman who did this to her family. She filed reports in 3 states. Nobody's been able to locate her, until now. I sat down hard at the kitchen table. A father, a real father, who'd worked his whole life to build something, who'd trusted the wrong person into his family and lost everything, and found no way forward from that loss. That could have been Nathan's whole world instead of hers, if he hadn't opened that laptop 3 weeks ago. "Is she working alone?" I asked. Ray said he didn't think so. The documentation used in both prior operations, the legal-sounding language, the precise beneficiary paperwork, traced back to a shell consulting firm registered in Nevada, run by a man named Curtis Fenwick, a former paralegal who'd left an estate law firm under circumstances nobody would discuss. "He prepares the documents," Ray said. "She does the reconnaissance and the relationship. It's a partnership, and it's been running for at least 5 years. I need everything you have sent to my contact at the Bureau by tonight," I told Ray. And Ray, find out one more thing for me. Find out who told her about my son. Because a woman running an operation out of Denver doesn't stumble onto a structural engineer from Broken Arrow with a $2 million ranch and a paid-off insurance policy by accident. Somebody handed her that information. Ray called back 2 nights later, and what he told me changed the shape of everything. 15 years ago, before I made detective, I'd worked a fraud case that put a man named Gordon Ashby in federal prison for 11 years, an insurance scam that had defrauded elderly clients out of their retirement savings, several of whom lost their homes. My testimony had been central to the conviction. Gordon Ashby had a younger half-sister. Her name was Renee. She'd blamed me for over a decade for her brother dying inside that prison of an untreated heart condition 3 years into his sentence, and she'd apparently spent those years since building a very specific, very patient kind of revenge, one operation at a time, each one aimed at families connected to men who'd once put people like her brother away. Somebody had been feeding her information about every target for years. Somebody who knew which retired cops had adult children, which families had assets worth the risk, and exactly when to point her. That somebody, Ray found 2 days later after pulling financial records, was a disbarred former Tulsa attorney named Preston Yates, a man I'd testified against in a judicial ethics hearing 11 years earlier after uncovering he'd been taking payments to bury evidence in 3 separate cases. He'd lost his license, his practice, and his reputation because of my testimony, and he'd spent the years since quietly funding Renee's operations in exchange for one thing: watching men like me lose the families they'd spent their whole lives protecting. Nathan and I worked with the FBI for the final 10 days before the wedding, wearing a small recorder, letting Renee believe everything was proceeding exactly on schedule right up until the morning of the ceremony, when 2 agents were waiting outside the church, and Curtis Fenwick was arrested at a print shop 3 miles away, with the beneficiary documents still in his printer. Renee Ashby received 14 years in federal prison. Curtis Fenwick received 9. Preston Yates, the man behind all of it, received 11 years and stood in that courtroom with no expression at all when the sentence was read, because some men only ever regret getting caught. Melissa Whitcomb was in that courtroom too, sitting 3 rows behind me, and afterward, she found me in the hallway and said her father would have been glad, not happy, but glad that it was finally named and counted. I think about those words more than almost anything else from that whole year. Nathan married a woman named Julia the following spring, a physical therapist he met through mutual friends, someone with a messy, ordinary, wonderful history, full of the small contradictions real people carry. Carol would have liked her enormously. I ran a background check anyway, out of old habit, and found nothing but a life honestly lived. I still sit on that west-facing porch most evenings, and some nights I swear I can still hear Carol's voice, quiet and certain, telling me I kept my promise. Both of them. I've learned this much in 64 years and 29 of them wearing a badge. Your instincts exist for a reason, and love without a little healthy suspicion is a door left wide open in a storm. You can trust the people you love completely and still pay attention. Those 2 things were never opposites. They were always meant to work together. If this story moved you tonight, tell me where you're watching from. Share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe, because there's another story waiting for you very soon. Thank you for staying with me until the very end. Claude responded, 6 words whispered at the right moment saved a family fortune, but it was years of quiet attention that made those 6 words possible. 6 words whispered at the right moment saved a family fortune, but it was years of quiet attention that made those 6 words possible. The people we love don't need us to suspect them. They need us to keep showing up, keep noticing, keep asking one more question. That's not distrust. That's just love doing its job well, staying awake so the people we cherish never have to face trouble alone. A small note for you. This story was written and fictionalized by AI for entertainment purposes, while hoping to share a positive life lesson along the way.